ultimately you decide at one point that I'm going to put this in a book because the Times is not going to report it. And that ends up
Right.
basically forcing their hand. Just walk us through that.
Right. Yeah. Well, the backstory to that is that this was like over the previous couple of years, I've had a whole bunch of other stories killed by the paper on the same grounds, where the government would say, you know, this if you run this story, it'll harm national security. So by the time this case happened, I'd heard their arguments about a whole number of stories, and so to me, they were just crying wolf constantly, and so I just decided I wasn't being allowed to cover the war on terror the way I thought it should be covered, and so I decided to write a book and include this story and another story that had been killed by the editors, and some other things that I had learned. And so I just decided to put it in a book. And then after I wrote the manuscript and had it, and my publisher had mostly edited it, I told the Times, I'm putting these in my book. You should run the stories. And
And
that led to a whole series of very tense meetings between me and the editors.
I would imagine that they felt like, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, what strikes me about that is like, what happened to their concerns? I mean, obviously they still had some, but the idea that they would get scooped by their own reporter seems to have outweighed their, the concerns that had kept the story out of print for all those years.
Well, actually, what they did was they told me we will reconsider running it, but they wouldn't commit to running the story, the NSA story, even though I told them it was going to be in my book. They just said, I think the way they phrased it was, we will agree to reconsider it and we will reopen negotiations with the government, but if we decide at the end of that process that we still don't think we should run it, we want you to take it out of your book. And that was as far as I could push them. And I said, okay, fine. But I never intended to take it out of my book. And it was too late to do that anyway. So it meant that I was playing a really serious game of chicken with them as they reopened negotiations with the government and decided whether they would publish the story. And my book, the publication date was kind of bearing down. So it was a very incredibly stressful time for me.
I would imagine. And we should say, and the other story, or at least one of the major stories that was in State of War, was a story that you had reported about a CIA plan to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program by basically. Why don't you tell the story of this? Because this is relevant in about 3 or 4 different ways to where we are today. Uh,
Yeah, I found out about this story about a year before I found out about the NSA story, and it was basically the CIA had a botched operation, very poorly managed operation, to get a Russian to hand over nuclear blueprints to the Iranians. And these blueprints were supposedly had flaws embedded in them to make sure that, if the Iranians built a nuclear weapon from this, it would be a dud. But the flaws had been put in such a way that they were obvious to and so the Russian was very afraid, I think, and sent a letter to the Iranians when he handed over the blueprint that you will see that there are problems with these blueprints. And so this whole idea that they were trying to fool the Iranians kind of got botched. And So I wrote about this harebrained program and wrote a story, and I called the CIA for comment in 2003. And Condoleezza Rice called the Washington bureau chief and demanded that we meet. And I went over to the White House with the bureau chief, and Condoleezza Rice was there along with George Tenet, the CIA director. And Condoleezza Rice stared at me and said, "I want you to destroy your notes, never make another phone call on this story, and forget that you know anything about this." And so, we left that meeting. It was kind of intimidating, but it was also great confirmation of the story.
Right.
And
weird
so
authority. I mean, like, under what authority does someone say that to a reporter?
No authority whatsoever. So anyway, that the story had been killed after that by the Times because the White House, claimed it would damage national security. And then there had been other stories that killed for national security grounds too. And so by the time the NSA thing happened, I felt like I was fed up, and I just felt like I wouldn't respect myself if I kept going along with this stuff.
What's the argument that the story about I guess that was Operation Merlin, was the attempt to send bad plans? What's the argument that revelation is going to hurt national security?
Well, they argued that I was wrong when I said that the program was mismanaged. They thought, oh yes, this has been perfectly managed, and we've completely fooled the Iranians. And
okay.
So that was their basic argument. But in fact, several people at the CIA knew that this operation was either a dud or mismanaged. And it was pretty widely known within the agency that this had not worked. But, they don't want to admit things like that.
Well, that seems to be the sort of, that seems to be the big theme with this, right? It's not.
Well, that's what I've learned. That's what the thing I've learned about this whole process of when the government tries to crack down on the press and try to stop the publication of stories. It's almost always just to avoid embarrassment. And yet they use the national security card as a way to convince editors, to put the fear of God into editors,
I mean, that's whether it's like, I guess there was that Thomas Drake thing with Trailblazer. I mean, it always seems to be covering up incompetence. That
right.
is,
or something that's illegal.
Right. Right.
So,
which is,
I think one of the things I've told people is I think you go back through history, I don't think you can find a single newspaper story that has ever really damaged national security of the United States. And I think that's what nobody wants to admit, is that the government always makes these claims, and yet there's no proof that national security has ever been harmed by the press.
And in fact, you were, you were fully prosecuted, but you were more or less, I guess, prosecuted in some regard, or under threat of prosecution, not just in during the Bush administration, specifically because of that Operation Merlin story, but ultimately with the Obama administration. Tell me about that time when you thought, okay, all right, Bush is out of here in X number of months. So if I can just hang in there until then, I'm surely this is going to end.
Right.
when did you
Right.
realize that was not going to be the case? And tell us about that, because ultimately your source, Jeffrey Sterling, ended up being convicted of violating the Espionage Act.
Well, it's not. I can't discuss whether or not he was a source or not.
Okay. Well,
I'm never going to comment on who who was or was not a source for that story.
All right, fair enough.
What I can say is that in 2008, I was subpoenaed by the Justice Department as part of a leak investigation into my book, State of War, and they focused on the chapter that included the story of Merlin, which the New York Times had never run. And then I fought the subpoena. And as you said, since it began in 2008, I thought if we can just hang on for a few months, there's an election coming up, and it looked like Obama might win. And so I was hoping that the whole thing would go away. And then the judge in my case kind of let it slow-rolled it, I think, for the same reason. And then June or July of 2009, after Obama had won, she issued a brief statement saying, well, I see that in this case the grand jury has expired, and that means that the subpoena of Mr. Risen is moot, and I give the government 10 days to decide whether to drop this subpoena or not. And I thought, okay, that was like an open invitation to the Obama administration from a judge to forget about this case and to drop it. And instead, the Justice Department under Obama said, no, we want to continue this case. And we want to, in fact, they said, we want to use the same subpoena that the Bush administration used. And she said, no, you got to get a new subpoena because you have a new attorney general. And so they said, okay. And Eric Holder then issued a new subpoena and started the case, kept the case going, and became even more aggressive. And when she quashed that subpoena that Holder had issued, they issued another one for the trial to force me to testify. And then she quashed that subpoena, and then they appealed her decision to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in arguing that there was the basic argument that they made, which turned this case into a major constitutional showdown, was that there is no such thing as a reporter's privilege in a criminal case. Which means, and they spelled this out, a reporter has no more right than any other citizen to avoid testifying. And a reporter has an obligation to testify and reveal sources under in any case that in which we subpoena them. So they were essentially saying the Obama administration's position was that reporters have no rights, no right to protect their sources. And it was shocking to me. And unfortunately, most of the press at that time ignored the case because, hey, well, we can't attack Obama on press freedom. It was like he skated by for a long time until the case went to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court refused to hear my appeal of their ruling in the Fourth Circuit, which the Fourth Circuit sided with the Obama administration. And so the ruling stood, which was reporters like Risen have no rights to protect their sources. And so the only thing I had left was to go to jail or reveal my sources. And so finally, the fact that this went to the Supreme Court started to get more media attention to the case. And that, the one thing I learned about Eric Holder is that he cares about publicity. So he was starting to get bad publicity. So the Obama people started backing off. And at the very end, when I had to go to one pretrial hearing where they asked me, will you reveal your sources? And I said no. And then they dropped the subpoena against me. And so in the end, they blinked, but they took it so far down the road that the legal legacy of the Obama administration is this Fourth Circuit ruling, which says reporters have no rights to protect their sources. And that still stands today, and the Fourth Circuit covers Virginia and Maryland, which is home to the CIA, the NSA, and the Pentagon, and which means that every major leak investigation is now covered by a ruling that says you don't have any rights to protect your sources. And so that is something that Donald Trump, I'm sure, will have a field day with.
What do you think? I mean, the Obama administration prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than I think had been done maybe in history combined.
It was more than all previous administrations.
What do you think? I mean, do you have a sense? I mean, there's no reason why you necessarily would, but I'm curious if you have a sense of why. Like, why were, I mean, certainly the expectation that you had, that the judge had, that frankly, if you had asked me, would have had at that time was like, yeah, no, this is not going to be, the Obama administration's not going to be known for being the most aggressive against whistleblowers. No way.
Right.
Why do you think they were? I mean, what was that?
I have struggled with that question for years, and I don't have. I mean, I can give you what I think what I think happened,
sure.
But obviously they didn't tell me. I was like the last person they would talk to about this. But I think it was several factors, and I think probably the most important one was they were afraid of. On national security issues, I think Obama was deeply afraid of right-wing attacks on all national security issues. And I think he saw himself as, his biggest priority, it seemed to me, as domestic issues, the economy, healthcare, other issues. And that on national security issues in general, he tended to extend and keep in place most of the policies of the Bush administration. And people don't want to admit that, but that's true. I mean, the one thing he gets credit for was ending the war in Iraq, which he ended it at the same time that the Bush administration planned to end it. And all he did was follow through with the Status of Forces agreement that the Bush administration had done. And so I think it was part of a larger view of national security policies, which were let's do national security policies in a way that makes it difficult for the right wing to attack us. And I think leak investigations fit into that. And I also think there was also a sense that Obama was never quite as liberal as people thought he was.
Right.
And I think there was a personal, I think on a personal level, he doesn't like the press very much. And then I also think, probably the technology had made it easier to do these kind of leak investigations. And so, you could track people and also I think the biggest, probably another factor was you had these mass leaks under Obama. You had WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. And I think those had played something had a traumatic effect inside the government, and made them gave them more of a zero tolerance policy. But none of that excuses the way they dealt with this, because it was anti-democratic and a real and very damaging to press freedom. And I don't think they ever understood what it meant for reporting in America.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos